Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Not kings, not queens, not bloody dynastic feuds. No, tonight we're talking about snacks, the real royalty of human existence. Because while monarchs might come and go, breadsticks and fried pastries are eternal. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's float back about 700 years to a time when people didn't exactly have Doritos. But they definitely had the medieval equivalent of, I really shouldn't be eating this at midnight, but here I am anyway. Now, when we picture the Middle Ages, most of us think of grimy peasants gnawing on a stale loaf of bread, while knights clanked around with turkey legs in hand. Which is partly true. Bread was everywhere, and turkey legs weren't. Because, fun fact, turkeys are from the Americas, and medieval Europeans had no idea they existed. So that iconic knight at the feast with a turkey leg image? Completely fake. What they did have, though, was an early version of fried chicken, meat pies, sweet fritters, roasted nuts, candied ginger, and even something close to modern French fries. Basically, medieval folks were every bit as guilty of late-night snacking as we are, just with more grease and fewer preservatives. Let's start with the bread. Bread wasn't just food. It was basically life. Medieval Europe ran on bread in the same way that our world runs on Wi-Fi. Without it, society kind of broke down. But when it came to snacks, bread got dressed up. The humble loaf was transformed into trenchers, basically edible plates, or chopped into bite-sized chunks and fried in animal fat with a sprinkle of honey. Imagine French toast, but without the eggs or the cinnamon, and cooked in lard. Delicious, but guaranteed to clog your arteries faster than you can say, Hail Mary. And then there were fritters. Oh yes, the medieval world absolutely loved a fritter. Apples, pears, or basically anything you could dunk in batter, toss in hot oil, and sprinkle with sugar. Medieval sugar, by the way, was a luxury, imported from the East, extremely expensive, and more like hard crystals than the neat white powder we know today. So, a sugared fritter was both a treat and a flex. It was the medieval version of rolling up to the feast with a limited edition Starbucks drink, but it wasn't all sweet. For every fruit fritter, there was also a savory fried ball of dough stuffed with cheese or minced meat. Think of it as the ancestor of the Hot Pocket, only instead of being microwaved at 3 a.m., it was deep fried in pig fat at the village fair, a delicacy that was probably both comforting and slightly horrifying to your digestive system. Now, speaking of fairs, this is where junk food really came alive. Medieval fairs weren't just for trading livestock or picking up a new set of cooking pots. They were food festivals. Picture rows of stalls offering roasted nuts, glazed meats, fried fish, candied fruits, and steaming hot meat pies. Everything portable, everything greasy, everything designed to be eaten with your hands, while you wandered around in a tunic and complained about taxes. The meat pie deserves its own sleepy spotlight. These were everywhere, from the humblest village to the grandest court. The crust wasn't the delicate, buttery thing we know today. No, medieval pie crusts were called coffins, which is about as appetizing as it sounds. They were thick, hard shells of dough designed mostly to keep the filling from leaking out. Often, the crust wasn't even eaten. It was just a container. But inside? Oh, inside you could find everything from minced pork with raisins and spices, to fish with almonds, to pigeon with, you guessed it, more raisins. Medieval cooks had a thing for throwing raisins into meat dishes, as if that somehow made them fancy. It didn't, but people kept doing it anyway. And then there's the fried fish. Because if you were Catholic, and almost everyone in medieval Europe was, you had a lot of days when meat wasn't allowed. Enter the fish fry. Herring, eel, cod, even lamprey. Yes, lamprey, the eel-like creature that looks like a medieval horror movie prop, but was considered a delicacy by kings. King Henry I of England allegedly died from eating a surfeit of lampreys, which is the most medieval cause of death imaginable. Forget duels or battlefield wounds. This man went out because he couldn't resist fish that looked like plumbing equipment. For the sweet-tooth crowd, medieval junk food included things like candied ginger, sugared almonds, and marzipan. Almonds were a big deal in medieval cooking. Almond milk was everywhere, especially on fasting days when dairy wasn't allowed. But almonds were also crushed into paste, mixed with sugar, and shaped into little figurines. Essentially, edible toys for rich kids, because nothing says nobility like being able to bite the head off a sugar-coated almond horse. And yes, before you ask, medieval Europeans did have something resembling donuts. They called them olykoeks, or oil cakes, balls of dough fried in fat, sometimes with dried fruit mixed in. Simple, sugary, and probably rock hard if left out for too long. But fresh from the fryer, a snack that would have made any medieval peasant forget their back-breaking labor for at least 5 minutes. Now let's talk about spices. Medieval junk food wasn't just greasy, it was heavily spiced. Not because they needed to cover up rotten meat, that's a myth, but because spices were expensive, exotic, and a way to show off. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These were luxury items from the East. If you sprinkled cinnamon on your candied almonds, you weren't just making them taste good. You were announcing to the world, I have money, and I'm not afraid to waste it on snacks. Which brings us to medieval drinks. Because what's junk food without something to wash it down? Ale was the default. Basically, a lightly fermented beer, drunk by everyone from toddlers to grandmothers. But if you really wanted to go junk food mode, you'd pair your fried apple fritters with spiced wine. This was wine boiled with sugar, cinnamon, ginger, and whatever else you had lying around. Hot, sweet, and guaranteed to knock you out after a few goblets. Basically, the medieval version of a mulled wine hangover. Street food also had its darker side. Food hygiene wasn't exactly top priority in the Middle Ages. Markets were crowded, animals wandered around freely, and hand-washing was more of a rumor than a habit. So those delicious fried pastries you grabbed at the fair, probably touched by at least 3 unwashed hands, cooked in oil that hadn't been changed in weeks, and maybe garnished with a side of dust from the nearby pig pen. But hey, if it tasted good, it tasted good. And if you got food poisoning, well, welcome to medieval life. The funny thing is, a lot of these foods are still around. Marzipan, fritters, pies, candied nuts, fried dough. They've survived centuries, which just goes to show that humans have always craved the same things: sugar, fat, and salt. Our ancestors weren't any different. They just didn't have Doritos Locos Tacos to make it official. Now, let's float over to something slightly related, but equally indulgent: medieval banquets. Because while peasants were munching on fried dough at the fair, nobles were basically inventing the medieval buffet. Banquets were the original all-you-can-eat nightmare: whole roasted peacocks, served with their feathers, reattached for decoration, pies that exploded with live birds when you cut into them. Yes, that was a thing. Bake a pie crust, put live birds inside, open it at the feast, and watch your guests be delighted as sparrows flapped around the hall. Nothing says fun dinner party like a bird poop hazard in your soup. Banquets also featured what we might call performance food: giant molded jellies, elaborately sculpted sugar castles, and meat dishes dyed strange colors with saffron or parsley. Because why eat normal roasted beef when you can eat bright green beef? Nobles loved this sort of thing. It was food as theater. Half the time, the dishes weren't even that edible. They were just there to show off how much money the host could waste. But even nobles had their junk food cravings. After the big, showy dishes, there were smaller, more comforting treats: sugared almonds, gingerbread, which in medieval times was more like a spiced honey cake, little fried cheese pastries, and candied orange peels. The kind of stuff you'd sneak into your sleeve to munch on during the boring lute performance. Because even in a medieval banquet, someone always got stuck listening to a lute solo. And here's a weird little fact: medieval gingerbread often came stamped with religious images. So, yes, you could eat a tiny edible, St. George, or Virgins, Mary. Nothing like snacking on holy icons to round out your meal. As we drift deeper into this story, it's worth remembering that medieval people weren't so different from us. They worked, they worried, they got hungry at odd hours, and they craved treats that weren't good for them. They didn't have potato chips, but they had fritters. They didn't have ice cream, but they had honey-drenched pastries. And if you were lucky enough to live near a fair, you probably knew the exact feeling of wandering from stall to stall, trying to decide between another pie or just one more candied almond. So the next time you grab a late-night snack, remember, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition. Humanity has always been a little weak when it comes to fried dough. And with that, let's gently float into our next chapter of indulgence: the medieval obsession with weird drinks. Because if you thought the snacks were questionable, wait until you hear what they were chugging down alongside them. All right, so we've stuffed ourselves with medieval fritters, lampreys, and enough raisin-infested pies to last a lifetime. But you can't just eat your way through history without something to wash it down. And medieval Europeans, bless them, had a drink for every occasion. Some were comforting, some were bizarre, and some would definitely land you in the emergency room today. Let's start with the basics. Ale. If you were living in medieval Europe, chances are you drank ale every single day, morning, noon, and night. Why? Because water was often unsafe, filled with bacteria from all the livestock casually strolling through town, and, let's be honest, the complete lack of plumbing. So, instead of dying of dysentery, people turned to ale. low alcohol, mildly fermented, and surprisingly nourishing. Kids drank it. Grandmothers drank it. Monks drank it by the gallon. It was less party time and more hydration with a buzz. Think of it as the medieval version of Gatorade, but brewed in a bucket. Now ale wasn't always fancy. In fact, early medieval ale wasn't even hopped. It was made with barley, water, and sometimes herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow for flavor. Hops came into fashion later, in the late Middle Ages, and not everyone was thrilled about it. Some traditionalists complained that hops made beer taste bitter and strange, which, to be fair, is what most people still say the first time they try an IPA. But ale wasn't the only game in town. If you had money, or at least access to a decent vineyard, you drank wine. And wine was not just wine. Oh no, medieval wine came in all sorts of forms. Spiced wine, mulled wine, honeyed wine, even wine thickened with egg yolks. Yes, someone thought that was a good idea. To be fair, eggs were believed to have medicinal properties. So if you were feeling a little under the weather, you could knock back a goblet of hot, egg-thickened wine and call it self-care. Medieval wellness at its finest. The most famous medieval wine concoction was Hippocras, named after the Greek physician Hippocrates, because nothing says medical endorsement like slapping an ancient name on your sugar bomb. Hippocras was wine mixed with sugar, cinnamon, ginger, and other spices, strained through a cloth bag and served either hot or cold. It was wildly popular, especially at banquets. Think of it as the pumpkin spice latte of the 14th century. Sweet, seasonal, and guaranteed to make you question your life choices the next morning. And then we have mead. Ah, yes, the drink that everyone on Viking reenactment TikTok won't stop talking about. Mead is fermented honey, sometimes flavored with herbs, fruit, or spices. It was ancient by the time the Middle Ages rolled around. People had been drinking it for thousands of years. But it never really went out of style. Monks brewed it. Nobles drank it at feasts. And poets sang about it in mead halls, usually until they passed out on the floor. It was strong, sweet, and dangerously easy to overdo. Medieval junk food in liquid form. Cider was another favorite, especially in regions like Normandy and England. Apples were everywhere, and fermenting them was basically free alcohol. Cider was often sharp, sometimes sweet, and occasionally mixed with spices or honey. Perfect for washing down your fried apple fritters, because nothing says balance like apple with apple. But here's where it gets weird. Medieval people also drank things like posset, which, if you've never heard of it, is milk curdled with alcohol and flavored with spices. Yes, you heard that right. Curdled milk as a beverage. It sounds horrifying, but people swore by it. It was considered both a dessert and a medicine. Shakespeare even mentions posset in his plays. Imagine sitting by the fire, sipping on a warm mug of boozy cottage cheese, and telling yourself it's good for your digestion, sleepy comfort, medieval style. Another questionable beverage was caudle. This was a warm drink made from wine or ale, thickened with bread, oatmeal, or egg yolks, and sweetened with sugar and spices. Basically, liquid pudding. It was often served to the sick pregnant women or anyone who needed strengthening, which is a polite way of saying, you're about to keel over. So here's some warm alcohol with carbs. Of course, monks had their own special relationship with drinks. They brewed beer, sometimes very strong beer, in monasteries across Europe. Some of the brewing traditions we know today, like the famous Trappist ales, started with medieval monks, because nothing says holy devotion like spending 8 hours a day making booze. To be fair, the money from beer sales helped fund monasteries, feed the poor, and keep the monks in business. So brewing wasn't just a hobby, it was basically divine side hustle. But let's drift for a moment to the noble courts. If you were a king, queen, or some unfortunate inbred Habsburg prince, your drinks were another way to show off. The wine had to be imported from the best vineyards. The spices had to be rare and expensive, and the serving vessels had to be made of gold, silver, or at least pewter if you were having an off day. Drinking was theater, just like the food. Picture a banquet where servants carried in golden goblets of spiced hippocras, while a jester cracked jokes about the bishop falling asleep in his chair, because even bishops needed their nightly hippocras fix. And then there's Aliberry. This was hot ale, mixed with sugar and spices, thickened with bread. Yes, bread again. Medieval people loved thickening drinks with bread, probably because bread was cheap and calories were precious. Aliberry was considered warming and comforting, a winter treat. Today we'd call it carb overload, but to a medieval peasant, it was cozy luxury in a cup. If you think all this sounds heavy, you're right. Medieval drinks were often thick, sweet, and spiced within an inch of their lives. Subtlety wasn't really the goal. You didn't sip a delicate Sauvignon Blanc. You chugged a goblet of hot, sweetened hippocras and hoped it didn't curdle on the way down. Now, a quick detour into something mildly tragic, medieval water. Despite the myth, people did drink water sometimes, especially in rural areas where streams were relatively clean. But in towns and cities, water sources were easily contaminated. Wells could be full of bacteria, and rivers often doubled as sewers. So water wasn't trusted. If you drank it, you were either desperate or unusually optimistic about your immune system, which is why ale and cider were the safer bets. But not all medieval drinks were alcoholic. There were also herbal infusions, what we'd now call teas, though they weren't using actual tea leaves yet. Monks and apothecaries brewed mixtures of mint, sage, chamomile, or rosemary in hot water. These were taken as medicines rather than daily drinks, but they were around. So, if your stomach hurt after too many fritters, you might end up sipping sage water while praying to Saint Roch for relief. We also can't forget about milk. Fresh milk was rarely drunk by adults. It spoiled too quickly. But it was used in cooking, in possets, and in caudles. Butter and cheese were the real focus because they preserved better. So the next time you complain about oat milk in your latte, just remember, your medieval ancestors were chugging curdled milk mixed with ale, and they liked it. Let's not leave out metheglin. This was a type of mead flavored with herbs and spices, often used as medicine. The name comes from Welsh, and it basically means healing liquor. People drank it for everything from colds to melancholy, which, given how much honey and booze it contained, probably worked about as well as modern cough syrup. And yes, there were drinking games, because humanity has always found a way to make alcohol competitive. Medieval students, soldiers, and even monks sometimes played games to see who could drink the most. Latin drinking songs survive in manuscripts, filled with cheerful lines about raising your goblet again and again until you passed out under the table. So, if you thought frat parties invented binge drinking, sorry, the Middle Ages got there first. To wrap this part up, let's picture the full junk food combo. A peasant at the fair, biting into a hot fritter dripping with honey, and chasing it with a mug of ale. A noble at a feast, sneaking sugared almonds while sipping spiced hippocras from a golden goblet. A monk in the cloister, brewing beer strong enough to knock out a night. Different classes, different flavors, but the same basic truth. Snacks taste better with a drink. And now, let's drift into another medieval indulgence. The surprisingly complicated world of desserts. Because once you've had your fritters and your hippocras, there's always room for gingerbread shaped like a saint. So, we've got the fritters, the ale, the curdled milk nightmares, and the honey-soaked everything. But let's be honest, snacks are only half the story, because just like us, medieval people had that insatiable craving for sugar. And once they got their hands on it, things got weird. Tonight we're wandering through the sticky, spiced, and often religiously questionable world of medieval desserts. First off, sugar. We take it for granted today. You grab a soda, a candy bar, or 3 scoops of ice cream without even thinking. But in the Middle Ages, sugar was a big deal. It wasn't just a sweetener. It was a luxury import coming from the Middle East through long, expensive trade routes. This meant sugar was basically edible gold dust. Rich nobles sprinkled it on their food to show off. Apothecaries sold it as medicine. And poor people? They mostly stuck to honey, which was the everyday sweetener of choice. But once sugar arrived, oh boy, did the medieval elite go wild with it. They made subtleties. These weren't just desserts. They were edible sculptures. Imagine rolling into a feast and being greeted by a life-sized castle made entirely of sugar paste, complete with knights on horseback. Subtleties could be anything. Saints, animals, allegories, even scenes from the Bible. It was part art, part dessert, and part, look how much money I can literally eat. Honestly, the medieval sweet tooth was less about satisfying cravings and more about flexing on your guests. Marzipan was another favorite. Crushed almonds mixed with sugar into a paste, molded into shapes, and decorated with food coloring. Sometimes they made little fruits, sometimes animals, sometimes bizarre figurines. A banquet could end with a tray of marzipan that looked like a miniature garden, complete with edible birds and flowers. Was it tasty? Sure, in the dense, chewy, vaguely almondy kind of way. But the appeal was more in the craftsmanship. Plus, if you were a noble child, nothing was more satisfying than biting the head off a marzipan deer while your tutor tried to explain Latin grammar. Then we have gingerbread, but let's clear this up right away. Medieval gingerbread was not the soft, chewy cookie you're imagining. It wasn't the snap of a gingerbread man or the smell of a Christmas market. No, this was a heavy, spiced, honey-based block of dessert. Honey was boiled with breadcrumbs, flavored with ginger, and sometimes cinnamon, and then pressed into molds. These molds often bore religious images, saints, crosses, biblical scenes. So yes, you could snack on a sugary little Virgin Mary while waiting for Mass. Holy Communion had nothing on Gingerbread Tuesdays. Now, the obsession with spices is key here. Medieval desserts weren't just sweet, they were heavily spiced. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, pepper. Why? Because spices were as much about status as they were about flavor. If your gingerbread was laced with cinnamon, it wasn't just dessert. It was a billboard saying, "I can afford imports from halfway across the known world." Sugar and spice were basically edible jewelry. Let's drift over to candied fruits. These were everywhere in elite dining. Oranges, lemons, even melons were boiled in honey or sugar syrup until they were sticky little jewels. Sometimes they were dyed bright colors to make them even more eye-catching. A noblewoman at a banquet might nibble on a candied orange peel while chatting about politics, or more likely, gossiping about who looked awful in their doublet. For peasants, the closest equivalent was dried apples or berries, which were more practical than flashy. But hey, dried fruit still gets the job done if you're craving sweetness. And speaking of dried fruit, raisins. Oh, the medieval love affair with raisins. We've already seen them tossed into meat pies like some kind of misguided garnish. But they also made their way into desserts, cakes, puddings, fritters, breads. If it could hold a raisin, a medieval cook probably shoved some in there. It's like the raisins had a union. You couldn't get away from them. Imagine biting into what looks like a plain honey cake and, bam, 3 raisins, staring at you like tiny medieval landmines. We can't skip over wafers. These were thin, crisp little cakes, sort of like an ancestor to the modern cookie or communion wafer. They were often served at the end of a meal with spiced wine. Wafers could be plain, or they could be flavored with sugar, honey, and, you guessed it, spices. They were easy to make, easy to serve, and very snackable, perfect for slipping into your pouch to eat later, when the lute performance dragged on for the 3rd hour. For something creamier, medieval people turned to custards and creams. These weren't quite like the silky creme brulee we know today, but they were close enough. Egg yolks, milk or almond milk, sugar, and sometimes rose water or saffron for flavor. They set them in little bowls or pastry shells, rich, smooth, and faintly floral if you got the rosewater version. Honestly, not a bad bedtime snack, assuming you could ignore the fact that refrigeration was a non-existent concept. Let's not forget the oddly named blancmange. Today, blancmange is a wobbly pudding. Back then, it was a creamy dish made from rice, almond milk, sugar, and chicken. Yes, chicken, because medieval cooks loved blending sweet and savory in ways that confuse modern palates. Was it dessert? Was it dinner? Who knows? All we can say is that some poor servant had to pluck a chicken so his master could enjoy his pudding. And then there's the medieval obsession with jellies. If you thought Jell-O was a 20th century invention, think again. Medieval chefs made elaborate molded jellies, using boiled animal bones for gelatin. They flavored them with sugar, wine, or fruit juices, and sometimes dyed them in bright colors. At feasts, they'd arrive as shimmering towers, often shaped like castles or animals. Guests were expected to admire them first, then eat them. And yes, sometimes they included meat, because nothing says sweet treat like a jelly molded from beef stock. Let's pause here for a moment and acknowledge something. Medieval desserts were not always what we'd call appetizing. They loved mixing savory and sweet. They adored throwing raisins where they didn't belong, and they had no shame about making pudding with chicken. But the point wasn't just flavor, it was extravagance. Dessert was a performance, a chance to show off wealth, creativity, and how many spices you could burn through in one sitting. But for the average peasant, dessert was simpler. Honey drizzled on bread, a baked apple with a pinch of cinnamon if you were lucky, maybe a small fruit tart at a festival, simple, rustic, and without all the gold-plated sugar sculptures. Still, even that small sweetness was a treat in a life otherwise dominated by gruel and cabbage. One quirky tradition was the void. No, not the existential kind. At the end of a meal, nobles held a void where lighter treats like wafers, spiced wine, and candied nuts were served. It was basically the medieval version of an after-dinner mint. The name came from the idea of voiding the stomach, which sounds medical, but really just meant clearing your palate. Imagine finishing a massive feast of roasted boar and peacock pie, and then politely voiding with a handful of candied almonds. The medieval stomach must have been built of iron. Of course, desserts were also linked to religion. Certain feast days had their own special sweets. Christmas might bring spiced cakes. Lent meant almond-based treats, since dairy was off limits. And saints' feast days were often celebrated with pastries or sweet breads baked in their honor. Food was devotion as much as indulgence. Eat your holy gingerbread, say your prayers, and maybe you'll avoid purgatory for one more day. And just when you think you've heard it all, remember this: medieval people sometimes dyed their desserts with bizarre things. Red could come from crushed insects, yellow from saffron, green from parsley juice, because apparently natural colors weren't exciting enough. If your custard wasn't neon green, was it even worth eating? Nobles adored this kind of culinary spectacle. Peasants, of course, didn't have access to fancy dyes. Their custard stayed custard-colored, which honestly was probably safer. So where does all this leave us? Well, medieval desserts may not have been Baskin-Robbins, but they filled the same role they do today. A moment of sweetness, a little indulgence, a way of saying, yes, life is mostly mud, taxes, and plowing fields, but tonight we have honey cakes, and that's enough. Picture it, a noble picking delicately at marzipan fruit shaped like a pear, while peasants roast apples by the fire. Different classes, same craving. Dessert as a tiny rebellion against the harshness of life. And with that, let's glide onward into something both tragic and fascinating: the aftermath of all this medieval indulgence. Because while they loved their sugar, their spices, and their fried dough, the human body had its limits. So next, we'll talk about medieval digestion, remedies, and why half of Europe was probably waddling around with a heartburn. So, the next time you're unwrapping a greasy burger, dunking fries into way too much ketchup, or shamelessly sneaking a slice of pizza at 2 a.m., just remember, you're not inventing bad eating habits. You're continuing a 1,000-year-old tradition. Medieval people were basically the pioneers of junk food. Only their version came with a side of questionable meat, a suspicious amount of vinegar, and possibly a rat nibbling nearby. Street vendors, taverns, and late-night cravings weren't invented in the modern world. They've always been part of human culture, because at the end of the day, no matter the century, people just love quick, salty, greasy, and borderline regrettable food. And honestly, that's kind of comforting. Anyway, that wraps up our journey through the greasy, smoky, and surprisingly familiar world of medieval junk food. If you enjoyed this little dive into the messy eating habits of the past, don't forget to stick around. There's always more history waiting to be served. Sometimes hot, sometimes cold, and occasionally left out overnight. Thanks for watching, and good night.